Can you support masonry on a wood lintel?
Remarkably, they don't rot. They tend to stay well for a long time.
So in new construction now, if I wanted to put a big timber wood lintel, I could do that.
Oh, of course, probably not now, but in terms of history, it's worked out very well.
So I can't have a wood lintel anymore?
That I don't know.
So here we have an image of what Mike was just describing. This is sort of a typical garage, probably built in the 30s or 40s. And it has a wood lintel, but this wood lintel has failed. There's some rot there in the corner and caused that typical stair step separation that we sometimes see. So I think the takeaway is, yes, you can do a wood lintel. I think actually you can still do it if it's if the wood is rated that way, you know. So our next question is, what is truss uplift? Wilmot.
Well, truss uplift is a modern phenomenon. You don't get it in houses with rafters, you get it in houses with trusses. These engineered units are designed to work in very specific ranges of temperature and humidity. And modern attics being very well insulated means that the ceiling cord, so the bottom cord that is against the living area, it stays nice and warm. But the cords that are on the sheathing, they cool. Now, then the wood cools, it shrinks, but the warm cord, bottom cord, it doesn't shrink. It stays the size or it grows. And the stress of that has to go somewhere. So it can't go down because you have the partition walls and the bearing walls in the way. So the only way it can move is up, and it can take the ceiling with it. It looks incredibly scary to see it, but it is not structurally significant because it will correct itself in the summertime. There's ways to mitigate the visual issues with it. You can have the floating, you can not attach the drywall. There's a whole bunch of different ways.
We actually have a couple of those coming up. And so when I show those, we can talk about that. But how do you recognize it when you're in a house? Like if you're walking through, what are the telltale signs that there's some truss uplift going on?
It's going to be in the center of the house. You're never going to see truss uplift on the outside walls. It will only be towards the center of the truss. So if you see cracks on the walls, the exterior walls, that's not truss uplift because that's where the truss is fastened to the exterior wall. But in the middle, you're going to see it running down the ridge area. So anything under the ridge, if there's a crack by the ceiling, you know, it's a good possibility that it is that it's truss uplift.
Kevin, how big a deal is it? How do you explain this to your clients when they see all these cracks and they start wondering, is that a structural issue?
Actually, I use Weldman's description of truss uplift, where the bottom is conditioned and the upper part of the truss, especially with the ridge vents these days, being within 20 degrees of the outside temperature, is very subject to these forces that are pulling them up. When I discuss it with the client, I basically tell them that the nature of the truss is it doesn't need any support from interior partition walls on the second floor. So if we wipe them all out, the house would still stand, the roof would still stand. But they do come up and down and move up and down, creating these cracks. Builders often give free crown moldings when this becomes excessive and they can't control it. And one of the things, and you'll notice this if you guys do new construction, is you go looking for this lift even before the house is insulated. And in almost every case, I will find where a particular truss, because it's drying at a different rate than the other trusses, is literally lifted off the nails that were connecting the truss to the partitions. Just something to look for. And it can be addressed at that point. You don't have to describe how the repair has to be done. You need to report it, what you've observed, tell it to the client, let the project manager know. The client, I always try to push the report to the project manager because I'm going to ask him to respond to each photo and each issue. And they have the choice of doing whatever they want to do, but I'm going to give them the issue because they have the opportunity to correct it at that point.
So Jim, is there anything you can do, I guess, retroactively when you start to see some truss uplift? And what can you do proactively to minimize the effects of truss uplift? You're on.
So, yeah, you install crown molding after the fact.
Check
That's
your
what I tell people to
transmitter.
do. You attach the crown to the ceiling, not to the wall. I'm not on.
Your transmitter.
On off switch.
On and off.
There we go.
Yeah, now it's working.
There we go.
Yeah, so, yeah, I tell people to attach crown molding to the ceiling. The crown will move up and down with the truss and the ceiling. And you'll never see the gap on the wall.
I thought this other option they had here, option A, was really interesting, where they put this little like nailer cleat there and let the drywall hang on that lip. And then you come in and it says 18 inches and you're just going to let that section kind of float around. I'm not sure if that's going to work, but I thought that was an interesting idea. They also have an option for some tie downs, essentially tie all of them down. Since you grab onto those interior partition walls and lock it all together. I think you're still going to get some stress with that.
That puts more stress on the trusses.
Mhm.
That crown molding just lets everything move the way it needs to move.
What is the difference between fire stop, fire blocking, and draft stopping? Mike, you got it?
I'm gonna pass on that one.
All right. We had this discussion as we were, as the question came up because obviously they have similar words associated with them, right? We got stop and stopping and fire. Wilma, want to jump in? Kevin, anybody have a sense of where we need it, what it is, why
Well,
it's needed?
There has to be fire stopping between each level. The whole idea is you want to prevent the spread of fumes and flame from level to level inside the walls, because that hidden space, you can get a lot of fire that builds up. Fire blocking is fire stop, fire blocking. I see those as pretty much
So I think
similar
fire
things.
blocking is going to be your actual like 2x material in the wall.
And then fire
preventing it.
stop being the
And
foam.
fire stop is going to be your foam,
Got
your
it. Okay, well, that makes
insulation.
sense. That makes sense. And then
Right.
draft stop, that's a comfort thing for energy level. So that's just filling in all the gaps on the exterior to make sure that no outside air gets in. So it has nothing to do with fire. It's not going to prevent anything like that. It's also not done with intumescent foam, whereas the fire stopping, that's that orange foam that you see is the intumescent fire resistant foam that I don't remember what its fire rating is, but if you're using it as fire stopping, you're supposed to use that.
So in new construction, if you're going in for a pre-drywall, you'll see the orange foam in all the sort of penetrations, but you'll also see caulk joints. Any sort of wood on wood joint is going to be along the exterior perimeter is going to be sealed with caulk.
Yeah, we always look really carefully when we're doing pre-drywalls for gaps in draft stopping, because that's going to have an enormous effect on the comfort level.
The
Energy.
actual.
Kevin?
I would add to that for the fire stopping, especially when you guys are doing the inspections out there in the pre-1940 homes, which are balloon framed, really go looking for that. If you can stick your hand up above the sill plate and see that space open, that's the ones that really need the fire stopping to them. So just something to look out for.
And can you guys hear me?
How do you report defective attic ladders? Jim, what are the things that come up with attic ladders when you bring them down? What do you see?
They're never installed right. They're put up with drywall screws or some kind of speed screw or deck screw instead of nails. You can use slag screws. They have to be the proper size. If it's nails, you need 16 nails, I believe. The ladders are never cut to the right, proper length, too long, too short. If you look at the hinges when the ladder's extended, if there's a gap at the hinge, no good. Ladder's too long. The older ones will always have loose, missing, or damaged hardware. The spring supports will be bent at the top. And these things are dangerous. I don't know how many of you, anybody ever been dropped by a pull down ladder?
Came close.
Yeah,
A couple times.
I got it twice. It hurts when you land on the busted ladder that just let you down.
I've had occasion to actually go get my telesteps and just not use the ladder,
That-
like
yeah.
open it and then
Yeah,
bypass
I've
it.
gone and gotten my ladder also because after being dropped a couple of times, it's like, yeah, just go get my ladder and put it up. People tend to buy the cheapest ladders on the market. There are lots better ladders available, all kinds of extension ladders that don't have that huge 10 square foot opening. How do I report defective ladders? Risk of sudden catastrophic failure and
And you're
severe
involved.
personal injury or death.
Mhm.
That's what I put in a report.
Now you're talking like your
Risk of
brother.
sudden catastrophic failure.
Yep.
Because that's how it happens. Yeah, oh, it's been fine for 40 years. Yeah, well, it's fine until it isn't.
Till you're laying on the floor. Wilma, did you have something to add?
Yeah, one of the important things to remember with these pull-down attic stairs is they are not repairable. They are supposed, if there's any damage to like the springs, or if the stairs are cut short or anything like that, it's not repairable. You are supposed to replace the entire thing.
Now, I will say when you find that like really old system where like the door flaps out and then the whole ladder mechanism slides and it's got the counterweight and when those are working, they're sweet.
Oh,
Yeah.
beautiful. Yes.
You don't find them that sweet that often. No. Kevin, did you want to say something?
And just what I point out to the client is that the rating on the ladders, most of them are like 250 pounds. And that's if they're installed perfectly. And any one thing that is amiss with the ladder, including age, diminishes that rating. And then I look at the client, I say, do you want to carry a 50-pound box up with you on that ladder? And it's like automatically they get it, it clicks. And it's an annual evaluation too.
Where should inspectors look for structural flaws? And Mike, you'll be able to help us here. I think with this image, we're talking about like hillside, trees, water, rock.
Yeah, well, of course, footings are supposed to be on undisturbed soil. You have what's called an angle of repose. Generally, it's 45 degrees, but it really depends on what type of soil or sand or rock you're on as far as what that true angle is. But when that angle gets compromised, then the footing is in danger of failing. So that would be one thing to look at as far as digging out crawl spaces. In a case like this, erosion, I've found footings that were actually out of the ground from erosion on very steep slopes like this. And, not only is it bad news, but trying to fix it, on a steep slope. I don't know how you get the soil back there to, get things right again.
Need a helical screw or something. So some other areas is settlement, like you were just talking about. It looks like this whole section, addition maybe, is moving. Oftentimes you'll see that where you have a house built, it's got a perimeter that's been backfilled, then somebody comes back to put an addition on that backfilled section and not really that deep and starts to move with the rest of the subsidence of the soil.
And when sometimes it'll be something like an added porch where actually the settlement happens the other way, where it starts to rotate towards
Invert.
the house,
Yeah.
because you really need to bridge over that disturbed soil with a masonry lintel and tie it into the foundation, and it's not done.
Place to look is if you have like a brick veneer and you get to these inside corners of an addition, you start to see separation like that. You shouldn't see any kind of a gap there. That's the clear sign that there's something going on. Well, do you want to talk about the bridging that we see sometimes, like right down in here, where you get some bridging between openings and why those cracks might appear?
Are we talking about a masonry veneer? And if you
Your
use.
choice.
Anytime that you've got the supporting structure, if it's gonna move down, it's gonna take that masonry veneer with it. So in this case, if you have that covered porch area on the left where that you have the diagonal cracks, then that column supporting that corner does not have an adequate footing and foundation. And the house is going to move down with it. Houses are made of organic materials. If this is a veneer house, then it's got wood framing, and wood is an organic material. It's going to move, it's going to flex, whereas the masonry isn't. So you're going to get the cracks. One of the things that you can do, it's not a trick, it's not really rule of thumb, but it's a handy hint, is if you have a crack, if you draw a line perpendicular to the crack, it usually points to where the problem is.
Good to know. Some other areas are going to be foundation issues like we were talking about. So you might have some heaving depending on freezing temperatures and also expansive soils. Hydrostatic pressure coming from the outside. In concrete construction, and I'll go back to Mike on this, what concrete foundation and slab cracks are acceptable? So concrete walls, concrete slabs, aren't they all the foundation?
Ironically, the last book that I read from an engineer that has studied concrete for a long time said, if it ain't cracked, it ain't concrete. Hairline cracks, they're pretty normal. And in fact, flat work, the same thing. One thing that we don't do much anymore that when I was a kid was routinely done is cure concrete. And if you don't cure concrete, you're missing out on its best opportunity to become incredibly strong through the development of silicates, where all the water was. And if you keep it hydrated, that water begins to create these silicates. And that makes the concrete very dense. And that's what keeps it from shrinking and cracking. If you just let it dry out, it will crack. And that's where most of the cracks we see as home inspectors in residential construction, most of them are just shrinkage cracks. They're pretty harmless.
And do you have a sense of the evolution of, I guess it's gonna be time, but why they stopped keeping them wet, why they stopped covering them, why they, not wait 28 days?
I think mostly it's just a matter of trying to get things done fast. Back when the Hoover Dam was built, they were very much into curing concrete. Back when I was a kid, again, most of us that have seen very old flat work has that waffle pattern. That was burlap, layers of burlap that were kept wet for at least a week after the concrete was poured. We don't do any of that anymore. Everything's about getting it done and getting the paycheck and moving on.
Two reasons people do things: cheaper, easier.
Mhm. One thing to keep in mind too is that there is a difference between a foundation crack and a slab crack, because the slab is not a structural component of the house. So a cracking in the slab, it can still indicate a problem, but not a structural problem. But it could be a soil issue. But generally in the slab, we see the shrinkage cracks.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I was going to add on to that with when we're talking about slab grade and bridging between foundations, what are crawl space elevation changes? Guys, look out there for split level homes. If that's in your field, the split level homes, one being a crawl space, one being a basement, or a slab and a crawl space. Remember, the lowest one being the basement had the moat or the trowel or the area that needs to be bridged between the slab and the basement or crawl space in the basement. So you can get a lot of water infiltration in the middle of a split level in the basement because the water is running under this bridge that we're discussing on the footing. And it can run right into the basement in the middle where you wouldn't expect it to be. And as Belmont was saying, when you're looking at your slabs, don't forget the garage, because the garage slab is partially on backfill next to that basement. And you often see that separation crack as it's leaning back towards the basement area, because that's where the soft soil was. It wasn't prepared correctly.
So here's some more structural issues, and we're looking at poured concrete wall, it looks like. And I guess this goes back to the question of what's a big crack? What's a little crack?
The rule that I generally follow, and the picture on the right looks like it's a CMU foundation.
True.
The rule of thumb that I follow is if I can fit my business card in a horizontal crack, it's structurally significant.
It seems like a low threshold.
It's a very low threshold, but that also, once it's cracked, it's not going to get better on its own.
I mean, it's not like truss uplift, it doesn't move in and move
No.
out.
No,
Why can't you attach a deck to a cantilever? And what's the solution? So I guess starting, Jim, what's the problem with sticking a ledger board on the edge of that bay window?
You're putting weight on the outside of the cantilever, which is going to tend to push up on the inside of it. And sometimes that happens without even attaching a deck. I've seen floors that are popped up. What's the solution? You frame around it.
Like this?
Yes, like that. Or frame around it, make the deck self-supporting.
So when I see older decks, I often will just tell people, look, the fix here is let's just get another beam and some posts under here and just not worry about it.
Yeah,
the issue with that is that if that post is less than 5 feet from the foundation of the house, then that foundation has to be as low as, the footer for that post has to be as low as the footer for the house.
Well, I'm not doing that.
So otherwise you can risk things like frost heaving.
Mike, what's a cold joint?
Cold joint is really when they stopped pouring concrete. They didn't do everything in one monolithic pour.
Can you do everything in one monolithic pour?
Well, usually you try to plan to do that, or stop at a expansion joint, control joint, something like that. But now, is it a big deal in residential construction? My personal opinion is no. Concrete, the average concrete foundation is probably, its PSI rating is such that it could handle 40 stories of a house. And you almost never see lateral, stress played out in a crack in concrete foundation, reinforced concrete.
So the one question I had in this image was just, usually you'll see a cold joint kind of come down like that, and the next truck comes and they'll just get on top of it. This one, I don't know if I'd be worried about that or not. Just is such a lateral line.
I would mention that I saw it, but unless I'm seeing, results of damage, I probably would just say, keep an eye on it, but I don't think it's going to do anything.
I mean, the main implication of something like that is water intrusion.
yeah.
Exactly.
So it does need to be sealed. You talk to a guy like the crack man back there, and it does need to be sealed to prevent that. But yeah, monitor.
Jim, what are those big metal stars you see on those walls of masonry buildings, mostly older buildings?
Those are tied into the structure to keep the wall from tipping over or keep the wall from deflecting outward.
Does that happen? Does
They're
that
wall anchors. And yes, it does happen. The walls will move, they will bow, and you got to get something in there to hold them up.
So was this added later, or is this part of the
Those are
actual
usually added
construction?
later. See a lot of them in DC in the old buildings where the walls are just gradually moving anyway. Also see them in areas where there's marine clay. And they are actually, in those cases, some of those, it depends on where the wall anchor is located on the house. If it's up on the gables, they have a threaded rod running all the way across the attic, pulling both sides in. In these older row homes in DC, actually, this is a newer townhouse, I think.
It is, yeah.
That's what I
Um,
said. But
But the older houses, they tie back into the joists.
Yeah, in this image, I wondered if these were actually decorative, only because,
No.
you know, that window on the left, there's like a wall sconce or something outlet there, maybe a garage on the bottom. That looks like a more modern house than those would be, but I can't imagine why you'd put those on decoratively.
And it's-
Maybe the veneer was coming off.
Could have been a fix. Can you cut trusses?
Sure, you can cut them. Are you supposed
Often
to?
do.
Are you
Should you?
supposed to?
Right.
No, no.
Thou shalt not.
How about an eye joist? Can you cut the flange of an eye joist?
No.
Wow.
Well, no, you can cut it, but you're not supposed to.
Right,
Yeah.
all right. Plumbers, I think plumbers and HVAC guys are their favorite tools, the Sawzall.
Mhm.
So an eye joist, I mean, we can't just notch out that whole top flange and the section there, right here. See that, the flange ends, and then it kind of picks up over here somewhere. That's not gonna work.
Well, and the way that I explain it to clients, it doesn't mean that your house is going to fall down tomorrow, next week, next year, but it's wrong. And these are engineered components that are designed to be installed in a certain way. Otherwise, they are not going to behave as intended. And maybe some of the stress that would go on that eye joist is now transferred to the eye joists on either side of it. And it becomes this cascading thing. It's, you know, like Jim said, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
The toilet might also get kind of loose there over time. That
So-
should hit, good.
I've had two extreme cases. And one was up here in Germantown. And the listing said bonus room and attic. Look out, guys. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So when I always check the attic last, get the ladder up there, pop the hatch, and sure enough, bonus room. All that was holding the roof up was 2x4s. Everything had been cut out. Everything. The other one was the house in Arlington where the wife, the lady of the house decided she needed more closet space and she called a handyman. And he cleaned out all the trusses above the dining room ceiling. Made a nice closet space for her.
I had a client call me, the gentleman called me and said, can you come look at this work that my wife's having done in the attic? And so I got over there and similar situation, she'd had her guy, Lido, go up and make a huge storage area, cut out made essentially a doghouse truss without actually making it that way. And I came down out of the attic and I said, Mom, you cannot do this. This is not safe. So I spent the next week talking to the guys at Structural Systems, engineering a repair, going in, doing the plywood gussets, glues, nails, the whole thing. But it was like 15 trusses, full web cut out. The only thing holding it up was the framing below it.
Yeah, the 2x4s are holding up the dining room ceiling, yeah.
What do you tell people? Let's say we're doing a new construction inspection. Is one cracked truss a big deal?
Yeah, go ahead.
I do. I mean, I report on every crack truss that I see. If it's a crack, if it's a bent gusset plate, anything like that, because it's, as I said, it's an engineered system. Its proper function assumes perfect installation. And if it's damaged, the stress on that truss is going to be transferred to the trusses on either side, increase stress on them. It's just going to become a weak point in that roofing system.
So Jim, and like the encounter I described with my mom, what would you expect if you're inspecting a house, a townhouse, where you get up there and you're like, whoa, this has been fixed? Well, what else would you expect to see as part of that?
Documentation. Yeah, I wouldn't expect to see it on a 1970 townhouse where someone's gone in, you see the big sections of plywood or whatever. But yeah, if it's newer construction, I would expect to see documentation.
So essentially an engineer's stamp or something.
Yeah, so I tell people when I'm doing a pre-drywall, if there's any damage to truss gusset plates or, whatever that needs to be fixed, that they should have a copy. I think a copy is supposed to be attached to the truss, but they should also keep a copy in their home binder.
So when you see a couple of trusses that have been cut or modified, does it really need an engineered repair or can it just be repaired?
Hollis.
It needs an engineer, but I was pleased to learn maybe 2 or 3 years ago that a lot of these manufacturers in the Structural Building Components Association, they have, for more typical forms of damage, they have the fix, and you can download that fix and the documentation.
So they won't even need to evaluate the condition. If you can assess that this is the condition that we have and here's a specified repair.
I'm not sure about the protocol.
Right.
I just know that that's available. That information is available.
Well, the code says that truss members shall not be cut, notched, drilled, spliced, or otherwise altered in any way without the approval of a registered design professional. Practically speaking, Hollis, in the field, these trusses here got damaged and they initiated a repair. And to me, that looks like a pretty typical repair. Do you think this got engineered? Did it need to get engineered? And I am asking you, Hollis, unless you're busy.
So you waited until now to call me out on this. It sounded like you were agreeing with me in the committee discussions, and now you're going to put me on the spot. Okay, I see how you play.
It's a nice jacket you're wearing.
So I think what we're looking at here, what this appears to be to me, is a probably some kind of an alteration that was made during construction. Right, all of the trusses have been reinforced in one way or another. So I'm a framer by trade. I spent a good 25 years out there in the trenches, and I've repaired more trusses based on engineers' designs than than you can imagine, and they're all the same regardless of what the situation is. The engineers, I'm convinced, didn't do any engineering. They simply grabbed some drawing and drew a square around it and called that plywood. Then they call the construction office and ask, well, what kind of plywood do you have lying around? And the response will be, well, we use 3/4 inch plywood for our subfloors. And so, well, do you have any you got any scraps of it? Yeah, we got some scraps. Okay, good. That's what I'll spec, and I'll put my engineer stamp on it. And I'm convinced that that's pretty real, and that all this talk about engineering is. I realize the code says that, and if you're involved in code enforcement, that's what you go by. But for home inspectors to spend a lot of time telling people that they ought to spend $600 or $700 getting an engineer to design a half hour's worth of work and nailing a scrap of plywood to the side of a truss doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Is that what you were looking for?
Something like that. It brings up a discussion that Hollis and I have been having where, yeah, sometimes it is pretty basic. And if you get in there and you see a repair like this, you might say the nail gun was set a little high. But there's nothing wrong with seeing a decent truss repair. And you'll be able to tell that it's a good repair if it's, plumb square, matching gussets, some glue sticking out. Kevin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just a thought for the guys out there in the field is one of the most common truss cuts that you're going to see is the pull down staircase in the center hallway of a colonial. And that definitely needs to be reported, and that definitely needs to be repaired. Use your own language, but basically it's a specialist that needs to come in to make that repair. Engineer, specialist, somebody who's a structural truss repair specialist, but it does need to be repaired. Call out the obvious things, the steps, call out the missing insulation over the opening, but don't miss the cut truss right there, because you got 3 of them in a row and sometimes there's only 12 in the house, so or less. Another thought is that as these trusses age, we're getting into the 70s with, well, they come from the 50s, but you get into that 1970s, 1980s, and they're going from their second to their third roofs, and you've had these roofs pulled off. Not only do your spacer clips, the things you've been taught from the books, but on the leading edge of the truss, against the roof, against the deck, the sheathing, whatever you call it, look for former water damage that followed the nails into the top edge. Because it's like a deck. When you look at the top edge of a deck that's been replaced, did they wait too late before they did the repair or before they did the new roof? And are the top edges saturated? Do they need to be repaired? Just something out there, guys.
This is an image I think Hollis had, and what we were saying is it looks like this was a truss repair, and then the HVAC guy came back and cut it back open. The initial repair for the return that he put in, and then Mike, you were telling me actually before we started an interesting thing about rebar and reinforcing steel. So what causes reinforcing steel to corrode, and what can be done about it, and is it an issue?
Actually, the latest book I was reading about steel reinforcement in concrete was pretty scientific, but it was talking about the fact that reinforcement in the first 7 to 10 years of concrete, they're pretty friendly to each other, but over time, concrete becomes more and more corrosive. The pH or something in it changes and it becomes increasingly corrosive. Of course, steel has the ability to expand to 6 times its thickness eventually. So it can really cause havoc when it starts to go bad. You also don't want your steel reinforcement any closer than 1.5 inches. And me personally, I'd like to see it more like 2.5 inches or more. So
When you say that, you mean like from the surface, like embedded
Correct.
in the concrete?
and it's kind of hard to maintain that when you're working with forms to ensure that you really have that distance. Another problem with reinforcement is the fact that if you're not curing the concrete, any voids that were not really voids at the beginning, they were actually water. If you don't have that hydration to let all those silicates form, they end up being voids that will continue to hold water on and off as it takes on water. And that is an opportunity for
Accelerate
rust
the
as well.
corrosion, yeah. So have we been using reinforcing steel with concrete for the last 3,000 years?
No, and in fact, I was just looking this up the other day, the Pantheon, 2,000 years old, unreinforced concrete, still performing. There is not one stick of reinforced concrete in the Hoover Dam or the Grand Coulee Dam. They're both huge monolithic blocks of concrete fit together like Legos. Steel reinforcement, this latest book I was reading was saying that steel reinforcement has taken a product that can last thousands of years and ensures that it's going to be a problem within 100 to 150 years.
When we were pouring our slab, we didn't do any reinforcing, any rebar. They told me that it had like some sort of, I want to say fiberglass, but some sort of material that was in the concrete slurry that was going to bind it all together. Does that sound familiar? Or?
I've heard of that, yeah. Also, they have rods that are they're really expensive, but they're I forget what the material is, but it's not steel.
Oh, the fiberglass, the Corning is, I think it's Corning is made, they're pink. They're pink fiberglass, looks like rebar, but it's pink, but it's not metallic.
Yeah, I'm not really sure it's fiberglass. What is it? Carbon
Okay.
fiber? Yeah.
But they're pink.
Carbon fiberglass.
Yeah.
Yep.
So our next question is dry rot a thing, or is it just wet rot that dried out? And I'm actually going to go down the line. Just a quick answer. Is wet rot a thing, dry rot a thing?
In my reporting, it doesn't matter. I'm going to report that there's rot on the joist and they may need to be reinforced.
All right, that's not the question. Wilma,
Okay.
is dry rot a thing?
I think I'm actually going to pass on this.
Mike, is dry rot a thing?
I think it's the most devastating form of decay that you can deal with floor framing. You know, that's when you can take a metal piece of steel for the insulation and punch it right through the entire joist. And a lot of people miss it. You know, with dry rot, a lot of times the bottom of the joist, if you're not careful, it'll be the full 1.5 inches, but almost immediately it shrinks down to much less. And you have to shine your light up if you're suspicious on whether it's dry rot or not, but you'll see that all of a sudden that thickness, of that joist has gone way down. And you can break off the entire bottom of a joist, or like I said, poke your screwdriver clean through it.
So what makes you say that it's not wet rot that just dried out? What's the difference between dry rot and wet rot?
In my experience, with dry rot will be pretty global. It won't be local to an area where you were seeing a lot of moisture, like where the joists bear into the solid masonry or under a bathroom. It's going to be everywhere. The last house that I did that had really devastating dry rot was just 2 days ago, and it was like in one half of the crawl space. And once it started, it went the whole length, probably 40 joists.
I think that the word dry rot is a little confusing, and it actually does need moisture to rot. It's just that the moisture content in a dry rot situation is much less than what we typically think of wood sitting in water. And it is a specified fungus that causes that deterioration. So it's not dry. It actually has a moisture content, but it's not wet.
Well, I think the big difference is also that in one case, it's actually exposure to water, and the other, it's just excessively high humidity
Yeah.
that just never stops.
Do we have any questions online from Larry? Any chat questions? Any questions here in the room?
Can you hear me?
Even if you're,
I
hey Larry, I
don't-
can hear you
You can hear me?
marginally. Speak up.
Because I tried to comment a couple times and it didn't seem like anybody could hear me, so I backed off. But one point I wanted to make was that the draft stopping is actually for when you have large open web floor areas, what you have web trusses under floors, and you don't want a fire to be able to spread in that. And anything over 1,000 square feet has to be broken into smaller areas. And that's what your draft stopping is, just to prevent fires in that area.
Then what's the draft stopping material?
Oh, it can be plywood, it could be sheetrock. You just want to stop that flame spread.